Well, welcome to so many of you who came to see me, and I'm very glad that Kristin could come along also. And we'll just be rushing through some of her million items of interest. Needless to say, as Grant mentioned, loads and loads of awards, nominations, of course some disappointments, no doubt. Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. That means, for those of you who are not Brits, it means that she's really Sir Kristin. And a Légion d'honneur, of course, and the BAFTAs and all that sort of stuff. Actually, today I heard of one very special one, which is a very close friend of mine. I mentioned I'd be talking to you tonight, and he went, oh. And then he revealed an extraordinary secret, which may come in useful sometime, which is that for the internet, when you're asked these secret questions, the secret question was, who is your favorite actress? And his answer was Kristin Scott Thomas. So buried in the cyber world is your name, and it may come in useful sometime. I did the duty of counting on Wikipedia, which is probably unreliable, unless it says something nice about us, in which case it's reliable. But it said something like 76 films, and of course we know about theatre. But let's start at the beginning. People always ask these questions, but I'm always intrigued. Why choose acting? Why choose, in a sense, to live other people's lives?
Well, that's a huge question, and I won't be able to answer it very fully. But I think the short answer is I don't know. But I think.
Okay, we'll move on now.
But I think it's just a curiosity. I think it was just curiosity about how other people behave, and what would it like to be in so-and-so's shoes, and what would it be like to be an orphan living alone in the woods. I mean, basically it was just an extension of playing as a child. So that's just how I've made my living.
But did you, as a child, did you live in the fantasy world? I mean,
yeah, absolutely pure fantasy. I would dress up as a child. We lived in a very small village of about 370 people, I think, precisely. And we had a village shop, and I would dress up and disguise myself. How do you say that in English? On se déguise into old ladies and various other characters, convinced that the Mrs. Vendyback, the lady who ran the shop, wouldn't recognise me. Of course, she always did, but that was it. I took it that far.
So that enabled you to steal things, of course, and she wouldn't recognise you.
Yes, exactly.
But when it came to, you came over to Paris as an au pair, and then you started doing acting courses and so on. As you went from the fantasy world to the real world of acting and seeing that you're actually having to live other people's, did you learn things like actor studio method and going inside yourself and suffering with everybody?
I think at 20, that's sort of an occupational. I mean, that's what happens when you're 20. You suffer miserably. But I think learning to act here was a very different experience. I think from or learning performance here was a very different experience from learning performance in, say, the United States or America. It was much more, it was less physical, less trying to find the real person. It was more cerebral and more, I would dare say, sort of intellectual. It was about text, mostly. That's what they teach you in French drama school. Mostly about text. They don't teach you singing and dancing and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. When you get to choose, which is already a certain stage, now I presume at the beginning you're on the weak side, and therefore you tend to accept things just because someone's remembered you, yes?
Well, that still happens.
Deny it. But the question that interests me is the relationship, say, between a screenwriter and a director. Now, screenwriters are really the forgotten people of the movie world, but at the very first stage, they are perhaps not the forgotten people, and you're sent a script. And is that what turns you on, or is it sent by the director and you say, I can trust this director? How do you approach that?
Well, I think it's a mixture of everything. I mean, sometimes you can read a script and just fall in love with it and really imagine yourself. And it really, it sort of, the words kind of sink in immediately, and you just imagine yourself and you imagine the other characters, and that's sort of a natural progression to wanting to do it. Sometimes you can meet the director after that and your dream comes sort of crashing. And sometimes, it works really, really well, and the man who's decided to direct this film, who wants to make this film, has a similar vision to you, and then that's easy, and then the choice is made. So I think it does work both ways, because then sometimes you get a director. For instance, this is what happened to me with for Mission Impossible, which Grant mentioned, which is not something that I put number one on my list of films, but I'm in it. And the reason I'm in it is because Brian De Palma was directing, and I would have done anything to work with Brian De Palma. And indeed, I think I did do anything to work with him, because I remember going to meet him in London, and he wanted to do camera tests. So he had this sort of funny old video camera on a tripod in the corner of his suite. Yes, actresses do go to directors' suites. And we ended up playing imaginary tennis for about 2 hours, and that was my test. That was my script. Well, thank you very much. Okay, you got the part. Very, very peculiar.
But somehow the end of that story you didn't provide, which leads me to the next question, which is, when you've chosen a screenplay which you like and a director who you trust, and you go and make the film, and you do it not in the order that we see it, and you see one day you'll be shooting the end and the middle and the beginning and backwards and forwards, and they say, thank you very much, we're wonderful, bye. The next time is the screening of the film. How is that?
Yes, and in my case, because I'm a bit of a workaholic, I've probably made 3 films between the end of that one and watching it on a screen somewhere. Sometimes I don't even recognise it. Did I really do that? Sometimes it's thrilling, sometimes it's disappointing. You feel totally detached from it. It's a very weird sensation, actually, because in the case of, I've had some terrific experiences. Really extraordinary, and I count myself very lucky to have made films like, like The English Patient, or like Gosford Park, or Horse Whisperer, or Sarah's Key, or a number of French films. There's a French, anyway, I'm digressing. So basically, when you get there, you have a memory of the experience, and the memory of the experience is sometimes very different from what we actually see on the screen. So the two don't match. So you feel it's a sort of out-of-body experience. It's a strange thing watching yourself after once you've forgotten the film. And then if the film's good and the film has a life and the film is being kind of accepted and has found an audience, then you kind of go on this huge current of success, and it's all very, very exciting, and you lose your head slightly and think you're the best thing since sliced bread, and then you come crashing down with the next one. So it's a major roller coaster.
The reason I ask you this is some actor, David Thewlis, was the one who I remember telling me that he went, having worked really hard on the film, and went there and was just totally horrified. Now, of course, I'm not asking you to say which times that's occurred. Presumably it has occurred. I presume also the other times when you felt this, I'm not sure where this is going, and then you've seen it cut and filmed, and you've been happy with it.
Just to give you one rather good example of exactly that. When we made 4 Weddings and a Funeral, we made it with about £2.50, and there were a lot of us around, and it was very kind of hard work. It was really hard work, and Hugh Grant was doubting Thomas. He couldn't figure out whether he wanted to be an actor or not, and I spent my life kind of buoying him up and saying, "You're really good in this, and indeed he was. And anyway, but I watched the film all on my own in the screening room at L'Étoile. I thought, oh my God, this is awful. This is just terrible. How am I going to get out of doing the publicity for this? And it's possibly the most successful film I've ever made, and it brought fame and glory to a lot of us. And a picnic hamper from Fortnum's, I seem to remember.
it's always sort of done
That
journalistic.
was our award. That was our award. The Picnic Hamper from Fortnum's was our reward for having made the highest selling film in British film history.
Just one, Hamper,
Yeah.
just one. People always ask favourite films, favourite directors and so on. You did mention, I read, I don't think it was when we talked, but working with Polanski was, you considered one of your high points. Funnily enough, and that was on Bitter Moons. And I should have a little footnote, which I went along to the production of that and watched some of it, particularly the ship waving around and so on, mainly to interview Polanski. And I probably showed that I don't have much sense of what was coming, because I never mentioned you or Hugh Grant in my article.
Well, I mean, it's funny because that's where I really met Hugh. And he said, I'm going to do this film, and I don't know if it's any good. And he said, but you know, there's a part you'd be quite good for. And so I had to go. And so it was thanks to meeting Hugh on Polanski's film that we did 4 Weddings and a Funeral. So he has a lot to...
Did you like the role in 4 Weddings? I mean, you were a bit of a...
Yes, I loved that role.
Well,
yeah.
you were sort of slightly sulky and observing everything.
Yes, but that was my period. That was when I was being, that was my sort of dark and sad period. I think I've changed a lot since then.
Oh, you've been obviously seeing too many French films at that point, because you were living in France.
I loved that. I loved this woman who'd been misunderstood and all that. I loved all that, yeah. And she had a great sense of humour. She was very witty.
Cuttingly.
Yeah.
Like all English people, cuttingly witty.
Yeah.
Now, do you seek roles? I know from our conversation 22 years ago that you did seek the role of Catherine in English Patient. Do you hear of a role going and say, that's for me, and go and grab it? And in the case, certainly, of Catherine.
Yeah, but it was only worked once, and that was then. So I do still do that, but rather half-heartedly. Yeah, I mean, I do still ask directors to hire me for certain roles, but as I said, it's only worked once.
And do those directors already know your work, or do they still now, Brian De Palma notwithstanding, ask you to come and do auditions?
No, I don't get asked to do auditions, which is a pity, because I think if I did, then I'd probably have a better chance of getting the role. But you get to a point in this business as an actor where it doesn't really matter if you're right. It's just they do something called running the numbers, and I've never really understood what that means. I think what that means is, actually, do you know? Does anyone here know what that means? I think what it means is they take the profit from the last film you were in, and then that's how it works. I think that's how it works.
Makes sense,
Yeah.
makes sense.
And so if you, whether you're right for the role or not, doesn't make that much difference. It's really about whether or not you fulfill the sort of budget criteria.
Well, the originality of Hollywood often seems to be first find a film that you've just done really well in, and then try and make an identical film afterwards.
Yeah, and that's really dull. I mean, that's possibly why I haven't had a sort of glorious Hollywood career, is because I really dug my heels in about that. I really didn't want to go off and make films in the desert again and again and again and again. And I wanted to make European films, and I've always been very drawn to European cinema, as drawn to American cinema. I mean, it's you know, I love film. I love watching film.
When we talked over lunch, I believe, paid for by the New York Times, not by me, so no thanks required. You told me at that time that you were terrified of playing sexy roles, of being desired on screen. Have you got over this? I mean, it's a tricky
again,
problem.
That was my dark period. Now I'm all for it.
So does this mean that the typecasting that we required of you a long time ago, what we called trapped by Britishness, you know, the whole sort of...
Well, the sort of shy and slightly
Well,
brittle.
Cheltenham Ladies College, if those Brits know what that means, it has a sort of double meaning. Not only is it, you know, posh private school for ladies, but it also is actually a metaphor.
Is it?
Oh, yes. She's a Cheltenham Ladies College sort of girl.
Oh, I see.
which, has meaning. Anyway, sort of upper class image, sort of withheld, slightly
For me,
intimidating.
it means scratchy green uniforms and 2 pairs of knickers. One white and one dark green.
But not at the same time.
At the same time. And having to, why am I talking about this?
It's all right, Americans don't know what knickers are, it's okay. No, but this whole question of being sort of slightly trapped, in our eyes also by Britishness. Anthony Minghella, the late director, wonderful chap who was directed English Patient, I talked to him at the same time, and he said, there's something about Catherine's character in The English Patient, which is like an index of England. You have to be able to cut that person open and find a Union Jack waving, and that was Kristin.
Yeah.
And yet, as they say, and yet, without even mentioning Brexit. No, but also it's interesting that Minghella, who was very, I'm sure you adored Anthony.
I did. I mean,
I'm sure.
Anthony was the most extraordinary person.
He said working with Ralph Fiennes and Kristin, and I'm sure most of you have seen the film, he said they were both, he said, a bit like thoroughbred horses, very sensitive, very jumpy, high quality performers. And then he said, at times I felt more like a horse handler than a director. I thought that at any moment one of them would rear up and bolt.
Yeah, well, it'd be hard to bolt when you're in the middle of Tunisian desert. But, yeah, I guess we were very febrile in those days, yeah.
Those days. So now, those days have passed and you've joined royalty, right? Well, we'll come to the audience on stage in a while, but also I think it's a good moment since those of us who've seen it recently, The Darkest Hour, many of us have, and probably some of us can still remember it. Not that you weren't brilliant in it, but we are of an age when we look at World War II films and forget them afterwards. I'd never forget, above all, your wig.
Oh, I love that wig.
Wig.
Oh, I didn't want to take it off at night. It just looked so gorgeous. Yeah, well, Clemmy Churchill had very famous masses and masses of auburn hair that turned white at a very young age. And she was extraordinarily elegant and sort of quite eccentric in her tastes, and wasn't afraid of making her own hats and her own headpieces, and was enthusiastic with the needle. And so that's why we have all those amazing costumes and those fantastic headdresses and that amazing sort of wig. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about making period films, is that you can have so much fun with the costumes. In fact, you can probably have more fun than on the type of film that I do. The type of film contemporary film that I do, I have recently sort of played quite serious characters. But when you can really play with a character which is based in the past, you can really have fun with the costumes and think about how different it is to wear a suit as a woman. I never wear a suit as a woman. I'm sure plenty of people here have to wear a suit to go to work. Or perhaps people don't anymore, I don't know. Excuse me. But I never wear
two pairs of knickers, one
white and one green.
But
I never have to sort of do all those things. So the way of moving when you're wearing one of those hats that Clemmy had, or if you're wearing a heavy, long 19th century skirt with the most insane corset underneath that gives you the smallest waist you can possibly imagine. And all those things really create a kind of atmosphere and really help build the character. There was a film I made called Angels and Insects. I don't know if anyone saw.
Buy a film.
And the costumes in that were fantastic, because it was all about these people who were fascinated. Well, my character was fascinated with ants, and we decided with the costume designer and the director that little by little this woman more and more ant-like. So we had these sort of twisty, curly hair that looked a bit like antennae, and all grey and very kind of hard and with a carapace, you know, which really, it was so exciting, of course, until I went to the screening at Cannes and saw what I actually looked like, which was absolutely terrifying. And then to hear all the journalists, and then vanity will sort of simmer through you, and you hear all the journalists saying, how long did it take you to get to look like that? And you have to say about 10 minutes.
Just in terms of identifying with roles, I mean, you just described Clementine Churchill. Could you imagine, did you have to imagine living with a real Churchill in that role?
Yeah, you do. You imagine it to a certain degree, but it doesn't really work like that. What happens is you do a lot of research, read a lot of books, and there's a terrifying quantity of words written about Churchill and Mrs. Churchill. There are a couple of biographies that were really, really interesting. And then you meet people and who knew her, and you meet her, you know, I was lucky enough to meet some people who'd known her quite well, and it all sort of sinks in, and then you start looking at the costumes and you think, well, what does it mean when you choose a pair of shoes like those rather than those, or what is it about gloves? And there's a wonderful story about her always having her newspaper brought to her with a pair of white cotton gloves, so she would put the gloves on, read the newspaper, take the gloves off, and then somebody take them away. So this kind of character. So who is this woman? And then so you're all kind of filled up with all this information. And then you get onto the set, and opposite, it was very easy in that particular case, because opposite, I had virtually Winston Churchill. I mean, his resemblance was extraordinary. And he is, as we know, an amazing actor, and his transformation was quite spectacular. I don't think I ever really saw Gary. I just saw a lot of Winston. So, and the words, of course, were really well chosen, and super well researched. So it was actually quite easy to do that, because the environment was perfect. The where we'd been, the world that had been created around us was so utterly brilliant. From the sets to the costumes to the, I mean, I don't know how many Oscars they won for those things, but dozens.
Going back a few to perhaps whether it was the moment where you're changing from one to another, who knows? I had the impression that after The English Patient, Hollywood discovers you and you did Horse Whisperer. Perhaps it's not such a simple passage as that, but having done Horse Whisperer, which I think was considered a success, I enjoyed it. Did you not want to stay in Hollywood?
So
why not?
It's funny that you should say that, because The Horse Whisperer was absolutely 100% due to the success of The English Patient. And the film wasn't a success.
Wow.
The film was a success. The film was a success in video and television and things like that, and international sales. But in America, it didn't do very well.
You're talking money, of course.
Yeah.
Or reviews, critics?
I think I can't remember what the reviews said, but it didn't.
It's all money, right?
No, but I don't think they were very. The producers were very particularly enthralled with the success of the film in America. However, internationally it worked really well, and every time it goes on television, everybody watches it. So I mean, it still has a life, and it's quite fun actually having a film like that, which is watched mainly by mothers and daughters. It's extraordinary the number of women who will come to me and say, "Oh, I watched your film yesterday with my daughter and we both cried," and it's a really good bonding film. So if anybody hasn't seen it and has a troublesome 14-year-old, then rent that movie.
And yet it didn't bond you to Hollywood.
But it didn't, to get back to it. Well, it was a tricky thing, because making The Horse Whisperer was a 6-month sort of endeavour. It took forever to make it, because in those days, for some reason, they used to do what they call shoot long, which I thought was the most terrifying thing. I want to shoot really short and get in and out as fast as I can, because I was bringing up my children here. My husband was working here in the hospital, so he couldn't move. So every time I went away, it was like goodbye, and that was that. So 6 months was a very, very trying period of time. It was too long. And then the thought of having to do another one, which I did almost immediately afterwards, because I shot Sidney Pollack's film, Random Hearts, practically immediately after that. And then I thought, I can't do this again. I can't spend my life the other side of the world when I'm trying to bring up my children in Europe, because I felt very strongly about bringing up my children in Europe, as I'm sure a lot of people here tonight think the same.
Since we're mentioning Hollywood, which has become something of a dirty word, dare I mention another dirty word, Harvey Weinstein, Me Too movement. I'm not asking for a list of gossip, because in point of fact, as we've seen, it's spread everywhere, including journalism and across the arts and across business and
Politics.
You name it, so on. But we see a major effort in the world of movies, of theatres. I mean, just with the Molière, big deal, for the second time ever, a woman was the presenter, and then the woman won the best director, etc. So, do you think this is changing something?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of alarm call, really. I think it was a bit strident, but I think it's necessary. And yeah, it has changed things already. People seem to be incredibly keen to make films with women directors and women protagonists, and I think that is can only be a good thing, because when you see the percentage of women, or females as we're supposed to be called nowadays, in the workforce in my industry anyway, I mean, it's pathetic, it's ridiculous. We're really underrepresented. And what is ironic in all that is, and I think I'm right in saying this, but I might not be, I think the greater part of film goers, people who actually go to see films, are women. So we should be making films for women, about women, by women. We should be doing it because that's the audience. And for some reason there seems to be a sort of blockage there. Or maybe it is going to change. I think the days of the white, middle-aged man having all the power in Hollywood, quote unquote, are over. I think that's gone. A friend of mine was trying to put together a film, had a great idea, went over to LA to talk about it, and he usually gets things done in about 5 minutes, and the trouble is you're white and middle-aged and male, which is sort of pleasing.
After Hollywood, after that experience, maybe I'm wrong, but I get the sense that because you're back in France, you began to make more French films.
Well, my first ever film was an American film made in France, which is why I got the part, because they were looking for cheap actresses that you didn't have to ship in from anywhere, who could speak English. So that's how I got that part. And the second film I ever made was a Swiss film that I made in French. So, and then there was a sort of long period of doing a lot of English-speaking things in a lot of English television that not many people know about, but lots of English television, what they used to call mini-series. And that was in the days when there was a huge audience for television, where we'd have 11, 12, 16 million people watching the episode that evening, because you didn't have it on demand. You would have to tune in on a Thursday night to watch which was quite fun in a way, because then everybody the next day talked about it. So there was a sort of community of those people who were the fans of, rather like there is today with the things like, the thing with dragons? Game of Thrones, which obviously I don't watch, but a lot of people do, and I think it's a sort of cult thing, isn't it? And I think that there were, in those days, in the days of television, good television in the UK, I mean, it could bring in huge audiences. Anyway, I did a lot of that. And then, and little by little, the French cinema started to kind of happen for me. And I've made some of my favourite films have been French films.
You, we briefly mentioned a film where you're fluent in Romanian.
Yeah.
Tell us about this film. I know you enjoyed making it, and I confess I haven't seen it. Unforgettable Summer.
No, it's a lovely film. Yes, it's actually the director died last week, Lucien Pantelier, so I'm a bit sad. But he made some extraordinary films. I don't know if anyone ever saw The Oak. Anyone ever seen The Oak? And then he made a film about miners. His name I can't remember. But he was a theatre director, and he was living in France because he was in exile. And when he went back to Romania, he made one film, The Oak, and then he decided he was going to make An Unforgettable Summer. So he came, and Marin Karmitz produced it. And I was asked to be the lead in it. And I said, well, I don't speak Romanian, what are we going to do? And he said, don't worry. We've got this great actress, and she's going to come in and dub you afterwards. I said, okay, that's fine then. So, why on earth I wanted to go to Romania a year after Ceausescu had been murdered, when there was nothing to eat, there was no, why I wanted to do that. I don't think I'd do that now. I had two small children going to this country where one 60-watt light bulb would light this entire room. It was quite an adventure. Anyway, we made this film with these extraordinary Romanian actors, and it was so débrouillard, you know. We needed to find, it was a period film, and the action happened in the 1920s, and we needed to find silk stockings. Well, of course, you can't find silk stockings in Romania. You couldn't find anything to eat. You know, I ate tomatoes and sort of grey cheese for 10 weeks. And so what she did was she knew that the Romanian ice skating team is very strong. So they used ice skaters sort of material to make fake silk stockings, and tablecloths to make the dress, and it was just fantastic. And I learned so much from doing that film. And in the end, they didn't dub me. It was my own voice that they used at the end, because I managed to parrot Marie-France Ionesco, wonderful Marie-France Ionesco, the daughter of Eugene Ionesco, who lives in Paris now, and who came patiently every day for 6 weeks to run through the script with me and teach me how to say the words. And so that really it's something I'm incredibly proud of. And it is a beautiful film about, basically it's about sort of ethnic cleansing. So anyway, it's the most wonderful film, and if anyone hesitates about watching it, they're a fool.
You'll be warned. There's a sort of cahier de cinema question, and it really is too long, because I've given myself a certain cut-off time so that you can ask questions. But in terms of French, UK, US movie cultures, the way people behave, the way people act, the way people, are they different worlds when you go on a set in the States or UK or France? Are you? No,
it's all exactly the same. The only thing that changes is when you're doing a big budget film or a very small film. The big budget film, everybody's got headsets and everyone talks like this really quietly, and no one will, and you can't sort of move, the actress can't move anywhere without being followed by 3 people, which is a bit creepy. And as they follow you, they're talking to their microphone. She's just stepping out of her caravan. She's just stepping onto the set. And she's just having a cup of coffee. What do they call it? 10-100, 10-100. Who knows what 10-100 means? On the lavatory. Yeah, or every secret is known to these people.
But in code.
In code. But anyway, so apart from that, and then doing these small films, which tend to be the films that I make here anyway, is so much more fun, because you might be 38 including the cast, and everybody knows everybody. Everybody gets involved. It's just so much nicer.
You do seem to have done at least a number of rather sad stories in France, shall we say, melancholic, whatever. I've loved you so long, which I think is just a fantastic song. Obviously Sarah's Key, and so they're all subjects, even Suite Française, which, I think, as they say, the book is better, but they're all uncheerful roles. I mean, do you feel you're drawn to that now? There's a sort of...
I would say it's about cheekbones. Because it's just, I can't help it. I've got one of those faces that looks sad, I think. I don't know why. I mean, yes. I mean, for a long time, using a kind of tragedy was a sort of motor, I guess. And then I cured all of that by playing Electra at the Old Vic, which sort of did me with tragedy. Don't need to do any more, thank you very much. But it's true that I have played a lot of quite hard and sad things. It's true, I admit it. But I don't think it's on purpose. I mean, it's not my fault.
Not my fault. All right, briefly, theatre.
Yeah.
You've obviously done much more cinema than theatre, and the theatre seems to have been, I mean, you will tell me you did some theatre way back when, but more in the last 15, 20 years perhaps. I mean, I guess Pinter, I see 2001 in my notes here, but the experience, I'm more interested in the experience of the two, the different acting experience. You don't have two takes, you're exposed
it's
every night.
Yeah, it's really fun. It is a very, very different experience. Of course, you've got the best bit about, I think the best bit about working on stage is the 4 or 5 weeks rehearsal that you get before. And then there's a sort of moment when you walk on stage, which is a massive thrill. And then it becomes really hard work because you have to keep that audience with you. You have to but I mean, it doesn't mean to say it's it's fantastic. Sometimes it can be so exciting. It really depends a lot on who are the people in the room that evening, who are the people who've paid a lot of money, because we're talking about the West End in London.
Outrageous.
You know, sorry?
It's outrageous.
Yeah. Well, not outrageous.
£180 for it.
No, that is nonsense. When did you pay £180 for a thing? Anyway, we'll talk about that later. So it can be very, very, very exciting, very, very thrilling. There could be, we'll talk about betrayal, for example, 3 of us on stage, and you've got to keep that tension. You've got to keep these people interested by telling the story within a very, very sort of narrow guidelines. Which have been decided and set out before by the director and by everybody, because that's what we do. We make the trame like this, but within those guidelines you can have all sorts of different things. So every evening people say you have to do the same thing over and over again. Doesn't it get really boring? The answer is no. It never gets boring. It's the most exciting thing. It's far more sort of tiresome to have to go in and stand on your line and speak in front of a camera and say the same thing over and over and over again, and then come back and do it again in the afternoon in the other direction. That's tiresome. Working on stage, when you walk out onto the stage, you've got 800 people all waiting there, and then you have to tell them this story, and you can tell it with such variety and such enthusiasm, or it's just the most exciting thing in the world.
I've had a little bit of experience on both sides, and there's this mysterious thing. That was a good audience. Oh, that was a lousy audience. How do you measure it? Whether they laugh at the right point?
No, it's not. It's always a surprise. You never know what's going on. Except you can tell when there's a bit of distraction, when people are distracted. Sometimes when people are too hot. They fidget and they yawn and they're falling asleep. I've got a friend who makes sure that the theatres are freezing, so everybody sits there in their coats, because otherwise he says everybody just goes to sleep. I don't know that about it, whether it's about the cold or about his direction, but we know that on a Friday night, the Friday night audiences are always a bit tricky, because Friday nights you've got the wife. She's really wanted to go to see this play. She's dragged the husband. They've had a couple of drinks at the bar before. He's just had a really tough week. I'll be brief.
No, this is merely saying that your moment is approaching.
Anyway, and so you can feel them sort of fidgeting and, oh God, I must sit through this. Oh, Pinter, I don't understand Pinter. And sometimes that can be really, really tiresome. And then there are the dreaded afternoons when the children, the schools come, and that is like, oh no, I've got to deal with them. But in fact, the thing that I brag the most about, and I am the most proud ever, is that when we did a lecture, which is about a young woman, much, much, much younger than the actress playing it, and her wrestling with her anger with her mother, her love of her father, her desire for revenge, her lust for having her own life. It was on the A-level curriculum that year in London, so we think, oh God, we're going to get all these schools, and they're going to come in and they're going to hate it, and they're going to be boring and bored and twidgety and twidgety, good one. And in fact, it was the absolute opposite. They were our best shows because the audiences, these girls, it was a girls' show. They were hanging over the top of over the balconies, just absolutely rapt, and that was my best achievement, I think. Much better than any of those silly statues and things.
All those girls celebrating a murderess.
Exactly.
Perfect. Just briefly, because your time is approaching, more theatre?
Can I just say something? She wasn't the murderess. She was much cleverer than that. She got her brother to do it.
She was very clever. One might almost say sly. Any more theatre on? Or?
I've got so many plans. I've got a plan afoot to do the Cherry Orchard, which is one of the last things left for me in Chekhov, which is heartbreaking, but there you go, I'll be nanny soon. And I really want to do Private Lives, and so I think that looks like that might happen the end of next year or the year after. But all that in London. Sadly, I can't seem to get hired here in the theatre, which is very peculiar, but that's the way it goes.
I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, I bumped into you and you were just coming back from Thailand, a very difficult film.
Ooh,
And you said to me, I'm giving up films. I'm giving up. And well, that obviously didn't happen.
I say that quite regularly.
Yes, no, I wrote it up. It was across the web, everything.
You've got a ready-made thing in your computer, haven't you?
CT gives up again. No, not given up after all. So that you will not give up. Obviously, it'd be wonderful for you to do the Chekhov and more. I mean, there's a whole series of...
I think I find filmmaking quite tiring sometimes. Even though theatre is physically 1,000,000 times more exhausting because you have to be so on it, you have to be so fit. So, yeah, I mean, I'll give up at one point.
Just on movies, one thing that I've been on lots of sets, and what always strikes me is just how much time is quote unquote wasted. I.e., the lights are never ready for a start. Take 2 hours for waiting for the lights, everyone's sitting around, and so all the stars, oh, she's going to a caravan, or whatever, off you go to the caravan. I mean, that must get quite tedious. You must think, this is 6 weeks, I'm earning a good paycheck for this, this is what it involves. There's no way around. I mean, I would have found it just too tedious, but not the theatre.
No, you've had
I mean, what do you do when you go to the caravan? Do you read books?
So boring. No, you can't read books, because if you read books, well, if I read books, I'm the sort of person who gets sort of involved. So if I remember doing, one of my first films was something called A Handful of Dust, which is an adaptation of the Evelyn Waugh novel. And I was reading Jean Rhys at the time. Well, he had to take it away, because every time I'd come onto the set, I'd be like, oh, this is awful, miserable, 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 because I was so involved with poor Jean Rhys's activities.
Okay, so I've just gone over 4 minutes over my self-allotted time. So if anybody has any questions, stand and speak loudly, and I will try and repeat it for those who can't hear at the back. I
don't think there is any difference, actually. I think it all starts it's going to sound very unimpressive, but it all starts with the costume. Because getting the costume right is it's like opening the gate to the character. And luckily I've worked with some extraordinary people here in Paris who have really helped me on Arsène Lupin, for example, or actually Suite Française was a British costumier. But it's all about, because you do that a long time before you actually start making the film, or even rehearsing, because it's very rare to have rehearsal on a film. I mean, you might get sort of 2 days or something. So it does start with the outside and you work inwards. So I don't think there's that much difference. The only thing, of course, is the language, which the more I work in England or wherever, it means I work less in France, which means my French gets rusty. So then I get nervous about that. So I have to sort of work on that a bit. But there we are. That's the only difference, really.
By the way, on Suite Française, the reason I sort of turned my nose up about it was mainly because it was done in English.
Yes, I know,
that was a production
isn't it?
decision.
I don't know why they did. I mean,
money.
Yeah, because the market for English speaking films is so much bigger, so that's why they did it. But it's true.
Sorry.
The first year I did a lot of mime. And then I had a really fantastic teacher called Marcel Bozonnet, who sort of took me under his wing, and because no one would give me roles because they thought that I couldn't speak French. What am I going to do with this girl? But he really encouraged me, and I discovered Marguerite Duras. And Marguerite Duras is very good for beginners, because it sounds really silly, but the way it's published is so encouraging, because it was Les Éditions de Minuit, for example. The nice, clear print on not too many words on a page, and it was really great for foreigners. It sounds so silly, but it was actually made you think about what each word meant, and it was really helpful. Instead of getting drowned by thousands and thousands of words that you weren't quite sure of the value of, there were few of them on the page, so you could really kind of think about each one, and so that helped a lot. Otherwise, I think I ended up, because of Marcel, I think I became, and he took me to, he was doing a festival of theatre in Semur-en-Auxois. And so I went to Semur-en-Auxois, and we did plays there. We did something called La Lune déclinante sur 4 ou 5 personnes qui dansent. God knows what it was about, but it was fun. And then the following year I did a Marguerite Duras play called Yes Peut-être, and so that's how that all worked. I had to be quite brave.
Someone from this side.
Oh no, I know. I used to love going to Bournemouth. There was a place called the Village Bowl where they used to have all sorts of things. I went to see the Sex Pistols there. I think it was the Sex Pistols. All sorts. I had loved Bournemouth. Bournemouth was so exciting. No, I was brought up in really. My ex-husband used to say I was never further than 14 cm d'une bouse de vache. But yes, I was brought up in the middle of the country, and I absolutely love it. And every time I go back, I feel that feeling of sort of landing that you have when you go to a place. Actually, it's not the only film I've made that mentions Dorset. Yeah, because the English patient, one of the characters in The English Patient lived in Dorset, and one of the last things he says before he dies is, "Come and visit us in Dorset. I know you won't." Something like this. Well, to answer the last bit first, of course, there's the Meryl. She is just beyond comparison. I mean, she's extraordinary. And then there are people like Maggie Smith, who I worship. And there's so many. There are so many actors who are worthy of adulation. But I don't really have, I mean, it's difficult. You just have to do your best. You can't think too much about the others. Now, the first part of your question, it was, do I find working on fictional characters or real ones more difficult? Making films about people who've existed is the most terrifying thing. Playing a character who actually has relatives who knew them, who, people who loved them. It's really difficult. It's really hard to be, because you want to be respectful, but on the other hand, you don't want to sort of whitewash or anything. So it's, and you can't be presumptuous, and you can't. It's really difficult. I find it quite uncomfortable, actually. I did enjoy doing Churchill, but that was because I was in such a good environment to do it, and we had so much support from the Churchill family and the Soames family, and they were all so helpful. But actually, I think I prefer preparing for a fictional character, because you can just sort of because you're inventing, and you can sort of dig out old feelings that you haven't used before, which is always fun. Gosh, it means sort of, I can't really analyse what it means to be a Parisian, because I just am one. Although I have to admit, I spend less and less time here at the moment. I mean, there seems to be more and more time in England, which I suppose is natural. I think you tend to go back to your roots at some point. But I love being in Paris. I think it's a beautiful city. It's a great city. It's a city which is very frustrating sometimes. It's a city that is fantastic to bring up your children in. It's small, and I think our quality of life here is much better than in other places that I've lived. Just simple things like being able to buy a tomato that tastes like a tomato, that sort of thing, that you really take for granted, and then you go somewhere else and you realise, wow, we are so lucky to be here. So we should all stop whinging. Be brave and go for it. I mean, because basically here, I don't know whether it's still the case, because I haven't made a film here for a very long time, and as I say, I make films in a very different way from how you're making films, because they want it's not exactly a brand, but they want the name, they want the package, with the KST package, but they don't. But I understand where you're coming from, but I think you just have to ignore that. You just have to go, because one of the really great things, another thing about Paris, which is great, is that there are so many different accents and so many different people, and historically French cinema has been full of people with dodgy accents. Think of Claudia Cardinal or Romy Schneider, or you could go on, and there was that wonderful actress in the theatre. What was her name? Irene Popescu. No, is that right? Somebody said, yeah. Who was Romanian, who had the incredibly thick Romanian accent, and she was the queen of French boulevard theatre in the 60s, I think. Yeah. So ignore them. Just go for it. Yeah.
Let me add a word of encouragement. If you go to any play that's been directed by Peter Brook or Diane Manoukian,
exactly.
You'll not find anybody speaking quote-unquote correct French.
Exactly. Yeah.
Next question.
Yes. I'm trying to do it as we speak. Well, not quite as we speak, but yeah, I've got a project that I'm getting off the ground. It's quite difficult. I've got a beautiful script, which I won't go into, but a beautiful script. I've got all sorts of people raring to go, and we've just got one hiccup to get over, and then we'll be off. I was until last week. I was shooting this summer. Yeah.
But then this event came up, and she had to.
Yeah, I had to cancel. But
Any more questions?
You know, it happens all the time. That I was once supposed to be making a film in the Balkans in I can't remember which country, but anyway, and I'd learnt in Bosnia, and I'd learnt Bosnian with a teacher for weeks and weeks and weeks. This guy would come to my flat, and we would talk, and he would teach me the words and teach me the words of the script, and I was learning the piano. And about 3 weeks before we were due to start shooting, it didn't happen. It got cancelled, and that was with Harrison Ford. So you can see how difficult, what a tightrope you're walking when you're setting up a film. It's very, very difficult. There are vast amounts of money involved, loads and loads of people. It all has to come into place at the same time, and things fall apart very regularly. So I'm not going to be discouraged by this. I'm just going to keep going. It's really hard. You don't hate them until you've tried to act with them. I've been actually very lucky. It's only happened to me about twice in 70-something films. And it wasn't hate, it was a fear, actually. It's really hard. You just have to. It's really hard, and you get bullied, and you get those were in those days when I was a younger actress. There you go. Yeah, there was a bullying and sort of the power trip that actors have, being number one on the call sheet. Sometimes it can be very exhausting to just keep brave every morning, and at 5 o'clock in the morning when you're called into makeup and you've got to go, and you know that you're going to be teased, or you're going to be made to feel stupid, or it's exhausting. It can wear you down. So that has happened to me in the past, and it happened actually not very long ago. But it wasn't the actor that was a problem, and it was somebody else, another member of the crew, and it was very, 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 very difficult. And I didn't make a film for about 4 years afterwards. Mm.
Is that a sort of multinational experience, or can you say that? I mean, in my experience of being in the movie world, which obviously just as an observer, as a journalist and so on, I mean, the ones who, it's usually Hollywood that is much more big deal, and the Brits and the French much less concerned about all that stuff. But maybe when it gets down to bullying, it's all the same.
I think this is all the same. I think people who are on a power trip and are going to bully you, they can be any nationality. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever. They can be male, they can be female, they can be whatever. That doesn't make any difference at all. The film is just an atmosphere of people with status, some higher than others, and with jobs to do. And there's this, as I mentioned before, this insane pressure to deliver because so much money has been invested. So a lot of people are very, very tense. It can be a very, very fraught experience. And then on other occasions, it can be the most wonderful thing, full of grace. You feel just touched by some sort of, everything's blessed, it works like on wheels. And there are some people who claim that films that are difficult to make are better films, but I refuse to believe that. And it's not because you suffer that something is going to be better. I'm against that idea.
Well, you can play a role where you're not deeply suffering, but you make us all suffer.
Yes, I'm very good at that.
A couple of more questions.
I think it depends on what I'm being asked to do. I tend to go for things quite instinctively. But then, of course, if you're playing somebody who is a non-fictional character, then you have to have a lot of research and you have to be sure. I once had to play a senator, an American senator. That was frightening. I had no idea about what even a senator was, really. And I bought Parliament for Dummies, not Parliament,
Congress.
Government for, anyway, whatever it was, I can't remember. And then I spoke to a lady senator. Anyway, it was absolutely terrifying. I was so unconvincing in the role as well. But you just have to do it. Horse riding in The Horse Whisperer. I've always hated horse riding ever since I was 6 and forced to do it. And because of the type of film I was being asked to do, and because of my accent when I speak English, I think people always thought I would be good on a horse. And I can't bear them. I really can't bear them.
Well, we don't feel too sorry for you, because somehow, unless somebody changed the name when they offered it to you, The Horse Whisperer does suggest a certain equine connection.
I know, the equine connection, and only as I signed the contract, I was so excited to do this film, working with Robert Redford, because he is the most brilliant film director. I mean, he's a hero of all time. And then, as I'm signing, I think, oh, horses. But actually, riding American style is so much nicer than having to ride English style. And cowboys are great. The cowboys in Montana were fantastic, and they really it made it much happier experience than I'd anticipated. But apart from horses, there's not. I mean, preparation. It's instinctive, really. I think I'd really like to have made a film with Lubitsch. I'd really love to have been one of those Danes. One of those Danes. Yeah, there are a couple. There are a couple, but if I tell you what they are, that's sort of mean. So, but you're right, there are a couple. I really regret saying no to Ridley Scott, because he is just a brilliant director. Every time I see a Ridley Scott film, I think, yeah, he really is the master. But anyway, he asked me to make a film with him, and I said no, must have been mad. Well, there's something called Tomb Raider, which I think is not anymore à l'affiche, but I really shocked myself in that. I thought I was so mean. It was really quite astonishing to be so cruel, and I understood sort of the past 20 years of my life. But anyway, that's, I think, unfortunately, I don't know whether we're going to do the sequel to that, where I really get my teeth into it, but it would have been frightening. Yes, I have. Yeah, I have. Well, I had to go and see a magician. I had to go and see... This is another wonderful thing about Paris, is that all sorts of strange people who do things to you with crystals and things. And I love all that. And I made a film called Leaving, Partir. Don't know if anyone saw that here. Which is a very passionate love story. And we were shooting in a heat wave in Nîmes. And the director and I had a very, very intense kind of relationship. She utterly identified with my character, and it was one of the most exhausting things I have ever done. It was also one of my favourite films at the end of it, because it's a really good film. But after that, I just felt so weird after about a week. And a girlfriend said, you've got to go and see Henriette, or whatever it is, and it's Passage de je ne sais pas quoi. So I went up, and she did things on a sort of ironing board and crystals. And I came out and she said, oh, toutes vos vannes sont ouvertes. So that was that. She said all my vans were ouvertes, and she closed them, apparently, because I came out of there. I closed them. I came out of there and forgotten all about the film, so it worked.
Well, I think we'll wrap it on that, for the very simple reason that I think one can safely say that no one, at least many times I've been in this building, has revealed their anatomy quite so. Your veins, darling, your veins.
What veins?
The ones you just had opened. But
Oh, my veins. Oh, in my van. Okay.
Anyway, thank you for the questions. They're all fascinating, and thank you all for being here. And of course, thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
And thank you, Kristin.